Hey, John. Tommy Gibbons here, professor of the course. Welcome to the class. Hope you are staying cool there in Phoenix. I have been to Phoenix this time of year, so I know what that can be like. And sounds like you've been there for a while, though, so I'm sure you're a veteran at navigating the hotter months. Looking forward to taking the class with you. I thought I'd send a reply video here in week one, get our conversation going, welcome you to the course, give you some feedback on what you've written in both of the response forums, which is great. I think you're off to a really good start. So I appreciate the engagement here with some of the secondary material. I think you're wrestling with some hermeneutical questions as well about, I like the word you said about thinking about audience, maybe before or in relation to the question of why or for what purpose a particular book is being written. And as you say, there are indeed some parallels between the circumstances of Habakkuk and his generation and those of Paul's audience. Of course, Habakkuk is a lament, a complaint about why why God would allow God's own people to suffer such cruelty at the hands of the Chaldeans. And this is the context in which Habakkuk hears this word from the Lord about how the just by faith will live. And this is, I think, helpfully contrasted there in Habakkuk, as you hint at in the first forum for this week. It's a contrast with those who are arrogant, proud, cynical, those who take advantage of a position of dominance and exploit or abuse others. And the contrast then is with the just who don't resort to that way of relating to others or understanding themselves. Instead, they live with a kind of vulnerability, you might say, that is an expression of their trust in God to provide for their life, their future on the earth, even over generations. So I think that helps us to kind of get at what faith actually involves. And I'm glad you're working with Witherington and Bart. They're not always aligned on some of these matters, so I think there's some generative difference between them. And I'm pretty sympathetic with Bart's reading of this passage because I think that sometimes we emphasize the faith of the human here, which is certainly in the sort of the foreground in a sense, the faith of the just in contrast to the proud way of the unjust. But we can lose sight of the fact that the faith of the just here in Habakkuk depends on the faith of God, the trustworthiness of God, that God will act in good faith, that God will fulfill God's promises, that God will make good on how God has revealed God's self to Israel in the past. And so the faith of the human is predicated on the faith of God. And I think that is what Paul is getting at, even though it takes him several stages of the letter really to unpack this, when he says that the justice of God is revealed from faith to faith, from the faith of God to the faith of God's covenant partner, the human. And these, of course, come together, faith of God and the faith of the human, in the figure of the Messiah, in whom they are one. They're the reality of one person, the faith of God and the faith of the human. And so that's why I prefer Bart's reading to Witherington's here, even though I'm sympathetic with Witherington's emphasis on the fact that this faith needs to make sense in the circumstances, context of the audience that Habakkuk is addressing. But even so, I think it's right to see the faith of the human as itself always growing out of the faith of God, and in a sense, is even a gift of the faith of God to the human. Um, anyway, so that's a way to understand what Paul is doing with Habakkuk as he's talking about the fullness of this from faith to faith, I think, in the Messiah. And this is a life that the Messiah shares with others. The life of the Messiah through resurrection by the power of the Spirit is a life shared with others, a life that grows among and in others, including the audience of Romans, including us. And so Paul is teaching the audience, I think, about how this revelation of faith sort of shapes the way that we treat one another. As we'll see as the letter develops, it has a lot to do with treating one another as God has treated us. Our faith is an expression of God's faith. And this means a kind of welcome, an openness to one another, even across sometimes tense or even hostile differences. So there's a very concrete pastoral need that Paul is meeting with this appeal to faith as disclosed fully in the body and the spirit of the Messiah. So great stuff here in Forum 1. And I'm also appreciative here of what you're doing in Forum 2, that you're highlighting that obviously the readings I've got us working with, whether it's Taubes or Mark Eliot, um, these these writers are pushing certain angles that may have been neglected in the way that Romans has been received in kind of the mainstream Protestant tradition that has emphasized the words of Romans to make sense of our faith. This is certainly the kind of background that I come from. And so, as you say, there is a political edge to Paul's gospel in the face of Roman dominion because it is about the dominion of the kingdom of God that, as we might expect from a Jew like Paul, who's schooled in prophets like Habakkuk, finally upsets the unjust kingdoms or governments of human beings. And in that way enacts the justice of God, bringing healing, bringing a shared life according to God's promises in the wake of terrible oppression often. So I think that is worth highlighting. It's definitely meaningful for the audience that is the most immediate for the letter, but it's also meaningful for us as we try to negotiate all kinds of social tensions in the US this year. I'm sure a lot of political turmoil and contestation, um, difficulty, I think, communicating across differences that are fueled in some ways by our political culture. And maybe one thing that I'll highlight just as a way of closing here that is relevant to us is, the political edge of Paul's gospel, while it certainly says something about the inadequacy or injustice of the government of Rome, it's not primarily a political rhetoric that is obsessed with kind of um, tearing down uh, the kind of ideology of Rome at the level of words or mere public speech. The theater for the power of the gospel, even the political power of it, as we read in Romans, is really how the people of the audience treat one another, what kind of life they carry on with each other, how they share a table, how they share their possessions, their goods with one another, how they share power, how they share time. They are a political reality, you might say, the community that Paul is addressing. And this can be lost on us in a day when, politics or political power has become sort of identified with electoral politics or jurisdictions of representative government or that sort of thing. And that's certainly a kind of front of political struggle that I think we need to take seriously. But I don't think that that is the primary front of the political power of the gospel as Paul presents it. And so I think it's important that in our context, however, we're going to engage in what kind of passes as politics, electoral politics, elections, you know, thinking of politics in terms of political offices and that sort of thing, legislation, we don't want to neglect the fact that our ability to be a healthy influence, I think, in those processes depends on the quality of life together that we're carrying on as Christians in our Christian communities with our other neighbors. That to me is a really important kind of context of Christian discipleship, and you might even call political action, even though it doesn't often get labeled or conceived of that way. But I think on Paul's terms, it is. So I'm sure be talking more about these kinds of things. Feel free to reply to this video if you want, John, with anything that it strikes you with or anything you want to say. No pressure to do that though. If you don't want to reply, just if you don't mind, just say received or something like that so that I at least know that this video came through and you're able to see it. Looking forward to the summer of studying Romans together. Great to meet you. And hope we'll get a chance to get to know one another through this course and enjoy some good conversation with each other and others.